At 11:15 in the evening on August 3, 1958, 400 feet beneath the Arctic ice cap, something impossible was happening. A steel cylinder 323 feet long was gliding silently through water that had never known human presence. Above it stretched an unbroken ceiling of ice, some of it 60 feet thick, extending in every direction for hundreds of miles. There was no way up, no way to surface, no way to call for help if something went wrong. The water temperature outside the hull hovered near freezing. The pressure at 400 feet depth crushed down with tremendous force on every square inch of the submarine's hull. Inside, the air was warm and breathable, recycled through scrubbers that removed carbon dioxide and replenished with oxygen generated from seawater. The men breathed easily, but every one of them knew that a single hull breach would mean death within seconds. Inside that steel cylinder, 116 men held their breath as their navigator checked his instruments one final time. The ship's inertial navigation system, a device so secret that most of the crew did not fully understand how it worked, confirmed what everyone aboard already suspected. They had done it. Commander William Robert Anderson stepped to the intercom. His voice, calm but carrying the weight of history, echoed through every compartment of the submarine. For the world, our country, and the Navy, the North Pole, the men erupted in cheers. Some embraced. Others simply stood in stunned silence, trying to comprehend what they had just accomplished. They had sailed beneath the geographic North Pole, the first vessel in human history to reach 90 degrees north latitude. They had crossed from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic through a route that every expert had declared impossible. They had done it in secret, without the Soviets detecting a single trace of their passage. And in Moscow, when the news finally broke 5 days later, Soviet admirals would realize that everything they believed about Arctic warfare had just become obsolete. The frozen roof of their homeland, which they had considered an impenetrable barrier, had been pierced by an American submarine traveling completely undetected. This is the story of how one submarine and 116 men rewrote the rules of the Cold War. The vessel that accomplished this feat was the USS Nautilus, hull number SSN 571, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine. She was not merely an improvement over existing submarines. She was a revolution in naval warfare, a machine that rendered every diesel-powered submarine on Earth as outdated as sailing ships had become after the age of steam. The story of Nautilus began not in a shipyard but in the mind of one of the most difficult and brilliant officers in American naval history. Captain Hyman George Rickover was an engineering officer with an obsessive attention to detail and an abrasive personality that made him enemies throughout the Navy establishment. He was repeatedly passed over for promotion. Senior admirals found him insubordinate and impossible to work with, but Rickover had a vision that would transform naval warfare forever. Rickover understood that nuclear power could free submarines from their fundamental limitation. Diesel-electric submarines were essentially surface ships that could dive temporarily. They had to surface regularly to run their diesel engines, recharge their batteries, and take in fresh air for their crews. This made them vulnerable to detection and limited their operational range drastically. A nuclear-powered submarine would need no air. It would need no fuel from the surface. It could cruise submerged indefinitely, limited only by food supplies and crew endurance. Rickover fought bureaucratic battles for years to bring this vision to reality. He cultivated congressional allies, manipulated Navy politics, and drove his engineering teams with relentless demands for perfection. The result was Nautilus. The submarine was built by the Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, under Rickover's demanding supervision. President Harry Truman presided over her keel-laying ceremony on June 14, 1952. First Lady Mamie Eisenhower sponsored her launch on January 21, 1954, smashing a bottle of champagne against her bow as the massive hull slid into the Thames River. She was commissioned into active service on September 30, 1954. Her specifications were formidable. She displaced 3,533 tons on the surface and 4,092 tons submerged. She stretched 323 feet 9 inches in length with a beam of 27 feet 8 inches. She carried 6 forward torpedo tubes and could accommodate 105 officers and enlisted men under normal conditions. but her true power lay hidden deep within her hull. The S-2W pressurized water reactor, designed by the Westinghouse Bettis Atomic Power Laboratory, was unlike anything the world had ever seen. This reactor used enriched uranium to heat pressurized water in a primary loop. That superheated water passed through steam generators, creating high-pressure steam in a separate secondary loop. The steam drove turbines that generated approximately 13,400 shaft horsepower for propulsion and electricity for every system aboard. The engineering was extraordinarily complex. The primary loop operated under tremendous pressure to keep the water from boiling despite temperatures far above the normal boiling point. Shielding protected the crew from radiation. Multiple redundant safety systems could shut down the reactor in an emergency. The entire system had to function reliably for months or years without maintenance, in an environment where repairs were essentially impossible. The reactor consumed no oxygen. It required no air intake. It produced no exhaust. For the first time in history, a submarine could operate completely independent of the atmosphere. On January 17, 1955, at 1100 hours, Commander Eugene Parks Wilkinson ordered the historic signal transmitted to the shore, underway on nuclear power. Those 4 words announced the dawn of a new era in naval warfare. The implications were staggering. A conventional diesel-electric submarine had to surface every few hours to run its engines and recharge its batteries. It was fast underwater, but only for short bursts before its batteries drained. It was essentially a surface ship that could dive temporarily to avoid detection or attack. Nautilus was different. She could cruise at more than 20 knots submerged indefinitely. Her endurance was limited only by the food supplies aboard and the stamina of her crew. Her first uranium core carried her 62,562 miles before requiring replacement. A conventional submarine would have needed more than 2 million gallons of diesel fuel to match that performance. The submarine also carried equipment that generated breathable oxygen directly from seawater through electrolysis. Carbon dioxide scrubbers kept the air fresh. Air conditioning maintained comfortable temperatures despite the heat generated by the reactor and electronic equipment. The men aboard could survive beneath the waves for months at a time without ever approaching the surface. This was the machine that would challenge the Arctic. To understand why the polar transit mattered so much, one must understand the world of 1957 and 1958. The Cold War had reached a fever pitch. The United States and the Soviet Union stood locked in an existential struggle, each side convinced that the other was preparing for nuclear annihilation. The two superpowers had divided the world into spheres of influence. American and Soviet forces faced each other across the Iron Curtain in Europe. Proxy wars flared in Asia and the Middle East. Nuclear arsenals grew larger every year, each side seeking advantage in the terrible calculus of mutual assured destruction. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. That small metal sphere, barely larger than a beach ball and weighing only 184 pounds, orbited the Earth every 98 minutes, passing over American cities and beeping a signal that every ham radio operator could receive. The message was clear. Soviet rockets were powerful enough to reach space. They were powerful enough to reach America. The same boosters that had lofted Sputnik into orbit could carry nuclear warheads across continents. The American homeland, protected by two oceans for all of its history, was suddenly vulnerable. 1 month later, on November 3rd, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2, carrying a dog named Laika into orbit. The animal died within hours from overheating, but the propaganda victory was immense. Soviet technology appeared unstoppable. American scientists watched helplessly as Soviet achievements multiplied while their own programs struggled. America's response was humiliating. On December 6, 1957, the Vanguard rocket carrying America's first satellite attempt rose 4 feet off the launch pad, lost thrust, collapsed back onto the pad, and exploded in a fireball broadcast live on national television. Newspapers called it Flopnik, Kaputnik, Stayputnik. The entire world watched America fail in the most public way possible. The successful launch of Explorer 1 on January 31, 1958, partially restored American confidence, but the damage to national prestige was severe. The so-called missile gap dominated political discourse. Many Americans genuinely believed that the Soviet Union had surpassed the United States in rocket technology and would soon possess overwhelming nuclear superiority. Politicians demanded answers. The public demanded reassurance. Something had to be done to prove that American technology remained world-class. President Dwight David Eisenhower needed a dramatic technological triumph to restore American confidence and demonstrate that Soviet dominance was an illusion. He found that triumph in an unexpected place, beneath the Arctic ice. The strategic importance of the Arctic had been recognized since World War II. General Henry Harley Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces, had warned that if World War III should come, its strategic center will be the North Pole. He was right. The shortest missile trajectories between the United States and the Soviet Union arc directly over the polar regions. The great circle routes that missiles and bombers would follow passed through Arctic airspace. A nuclear-armed submarine lurking beneath the Arctic ice would be perfectly positioned to strike Soviet targets. It would be hidden from detection by the ice canopy above. It would be immune to most anti-submarine warfare techniques that relied on surface ships and aircraft. It could wait silently for months, then launch its missiles without warning and disappear before any response could be mounted. But there was a problem that seemed insurmountable. No submarine had ever successfully navigated beneath the permanent ice pack. The frozen ceiling extended down in massive pressure ridges and inverted mountains called ice keels. Some of these formations reached 60 feet or more below the surface. The ice shifted constantly, groaning and cracking, creating a maze of obstacles that could crush an unwary submarine against the seafloor or trap it against the frozen ceiling. Navigation was equally impossible. Above 85 degrees north latitude, magnetic compasses become useless because the magnetic field lines point nearly straight down rather than toward the horizon. The compass needle wants to point at the magnetic pole beneath it rather than toward the horizon. Standard gyro compasses lose accuracy in the extreme polar regions for similar reasons related to the mathematics of their spinning mechanisms. A submarine attempting the transit could easily find itself traveling in circles without any way to determine its true heading. The crew called this terrifying possibility longitude roulette. There were no charts of the Arctic seafloor. No one knew the true depths. No one knew where underwater mountains might rise to crush a submarine against the ice above. Soviet mapping efforts had focused on their own territorial waters. American knowledge was equally limited. The region was as unknown as the surface of the moon. Diesel submarines could not possibly attempt the journey. They would need to surface every few hours to run their engines, and there was no surface to reach beneath the ice. Even if a conventional submarine somehow entered the ice pack, it would be trapped, its batteries slowly draining until the crew suffocated in the darkness. The frozen ceiling would become a frozen tomb. Only Nautilus could do it. Only a nuclear submarine could survive the journey. The dream of submarine Arctic transit predated the Cold War by decades. In 1931, Australian explorer Sir Hubert Wilkins leased the decommissioned USS Nautilus from the United States Navy for $1 per year. He renamed her Nautilus in honor of Jules Verne's fictional submarine from the novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and the famous author's grandson attended the christening ceremony in New York. Wilkins was one of the great adventurers of his era. He had flown across the Arctic. He had explored Antarctica. He believed that submarines offered the key to scientific exploration of the polar regions, areas where surface ships could not penetrate and aircraft could not land. The expedition was cursed from the beginning. A crewman drowned while entering New York Harbor. Both engines failed in the Atlantic Ocean, requiring rescue by the battleship USS Wyoming. Storms carried away the bridge structure. The crew grew fearful and resentful as the voyage continued. When Wilkins finally reached the ice edge near Spitsbergen in August 1931, divers discovered catastrophic sabotage. Someone aboard had deliberately broken off the stern diving planes, the control surfaces essential for controlled descent and depth keeping. Without diving planes, the submarine could not safely operate submerged. It would be unable to maintain proper depth or angle, making controlled under ice operations impossible. Wilkins suspected one or more crew members who had grown fearful of the voyage, but he never identified the saboteur. The culprit took his secret to the grave. The expedition had been deliberately crippled by men who valued their own survival over the mission's success. Despite the damage, Wilkins managed a partial dive to 37 feet and reached 82 degrees 15 minutes north latitude, the farthest north any vessel had travelled under its own power at that time. He could go no further. The expedition retreated, and the damaged submarine was scuttled in Norway's Byfjorden on November 20th, 1931. Wilkins died on November 30th, 1958, just months after Nautilus achieved the dream he had pursued for nearly 3 decades. In a poignant tribute, the submarine USS Skate surfaced at the geographic North Pole on March 17, 1959, and scattered his ashes on the ice. The man who had dreamed of reaching the pole by submarine would rest there forever. Other pioneers followed. Dr. Waldo Kampmeyer Lyon, a physicist trained at the University of California, Los Angeles, founded the Navy's Arctic Submarine Laboratory in San Diego and began systematic research into under-ice operations. In 1947, he accompanied USS Boarfish on the first American submarine Arctic ice operation. These early expeditions proved that submarines could operate in ice-covered waters, but they also revealed the enormous technical challenges involved. In 1952, USS Redfish conducted expeditions in the Beaufort Sea under Rear Admiral Charles Bowers Mommsen, proving that submarines had what Mommsen called complete mastery of ice-covered Arctic waters. But reaching the pole remained beyond grasp. The distance was too great, the navigation problems too severe, the risks too extreme, until Nautilus. Commander William Robert Anderson was born on June 17, 1921, in Bakerville, Tennessee. He was the son of a farmer, raised in rural poverty during the Great Depression. He won appointment to the United States Naval Academy through competitive examination and graduated in 1942, entering the fleet just as World War II reached its most desperate phase in the Pacific. Anderson served aboard submarines throughout the war, completing 11 combat patrols against Japan. He experienced depth charge attacks, emergency dives, and the constant tension of operating in enemy waters where detection meant death. He learned to trust his instruments, his crew, and his instincts. He learned to remain calm when everything seemed to be going wrong. These lessons would serve him well beneath the Arctic ice. Admiral Rickover personally selected Anderson as the second commanding officer of Nautilus. Anderson assumed command on June 19, 1957, at age 36. He was young for such a prestigious assignment, but Rickover saw in him the combination of technical competence, boldness, and steady leadership that the polar mission would require. Anderson would need to make life-and-death decisions in complete isolation, with no possibility of consulting higher authority or receiving assistance. The mission was classified top secret and given a deliberately misleading code name, Operation Sunshine. The name suggested warm tropical waters, not the frozen Arctic. If Soviet intelligence intercepted communications mentioning Operation Sunshine, they would look in entirely the wrong direction. The deception was essential to prevent the Soviets from positioning assets to detect or interfere with the mission. The polar transit did not succeed on the first attempt. In late August 1957, Nautilus departed on a crucial reconnaissance mission. By early September, she had pushed north to 87 degrees north latitude, just 180 miles from the pole. She travelled 1,383 miles beneath the ice during the multi-day exploration. It was further north than any submarine had ever reached. But the Arctic fought back. Nautilus struck ice, bending both periscopes and damaging her sail, the tall superstructure that houses the periscopes and antennas. Both gyrocompasses failed during the voyage, leaving the navigation team scrambling to maintain position awareness through dead reckoning alone. The submarine retreated to assess damage and analyze the data gathered. The information proved invaluable. Scientists now understood the ice conditions, the water depths, and the navigational challenges that the actual transit would face. New equipment would be required, including more accurate navigation systems and better instruments for detecting ice formations above and obstacles below. The first formal Operation Sunshine attempt began on June 9, 1958. Nautilus departed Seattle with her hull numbers painted over, and her crew forbidden from writing letters or making phone calls. Complete secrecy was essential. The crew did not know their destination. Even senior officers knew only that they were heading north on a classified mission of national importance. Commander Anderson had traveled under an alias, calling himself Charles A. Henderson, to scout ice conditions in Alaska. What he found was discouraging. The Chukchi Sea north of the Bering Strait averaged only 20 fathoms deep, roughly 120 feet. Ice keels in some areas extended nearly 60 feet below the surface. That left barely 60 feet of clearance for a submarine that measured 52 feet from the top of her sail to the bottom of her keel. The margins were impossibly thin. A slight miscalculation or an unexpected ice formation could trap the submarine between the ice above and the seafloor below. Making matters worse, the engineering team discovered a seawater leak in the reactor's condenser circulation system during the voyage. This was a serious problem. Seawater infiltrating the reactor systems could cause corrosion and potentially force a reactor shutdown. In a conventional shipyard, such a leak would require weeks of repair work. Under the Arctic ice, it could mean death for the entire crew. The solution was unconventional, to say the least. Several crew members, dressed in civilian clothes to avoid attracting attention, fanned out to service stations across Seattle and Everett. They purchased 140 quarts of Bars Leak, a commercial radiator sealant normally used to fix leaky car radiators. They poured it into the submarine systems and hoped for the best. It was desperate improvisation, but it worked well enough to continue the mission. On June 19th, facing impossible ice conditions and uncertain about the repair, Anderson made the difficult decision to abort. The ice was simply too thick, the water was simply too shallow. Pushing forward would risk the submarine and everyone aboard. Nautilus retreated and arrived at Pearl Harbor on June 28 to await better summer ice conditions and install new equipment. The second attempt launched on July 23, 1958, from Pearl Harbor. This time, Nautilus carried 116 men, including 111 officers and crew plus 4 civilian scientists. Most crew members still did not know their true destination. Security remained absolute. Mail was held. Phone calls were forbidden. Families knew only that their loved ones were at sea on an extended deployment. The senior scientist was Dr. Waldo Lyon himself, the world's foremost authority on sea ice and submarine Arctic operations. Lyon had spent more than a decade studying the behavior of ice and developing techniques for submarine operations beneath it. He had developed a simple but ingenious navigation tool by mounting an upward-looking fathometer atop the submarine. This modified sonar, aimed at the ice instead of the seafloor, could map the underside of the ice canopy in real time, allowing the submarine to navigate around the most dangerous ice keels. Lyon's presence aboard was essential. He could read the ice formations displayed on his instruments and predict dangers that no one else could recognize. His expertise had been developed through years of patient observation and analysis. No computer program or technical manual could replace his judgment. Anderson had learned through intelligence channels that Commander James Calvert aboard USS Skate was planning his own polar attempt via the Atlantic route. Professional rivalry added urgency to the mission. Nautilus needed to reach the pole first. The prestige of being first would magnify the propaganda value of the achievement immensely. The submarine threaded through the Bering Strait and surfaced briefly near Point Barrow, Alaska. Anderson was looking for the Barrow Sea Valley, a deep underwater canyon that would provide safe passage northward beneath the ice. The charts were rough, the navigation imprecise, but Lyon's instruments located the valley entrance. On August 1, 1958, Nautilus took her final radar fix on Point Barrow, Alaska, and submerged. She turned due north along the 155th meridian west longitude and began the most dangerous voyage in submarine history. There would be no more contact with the surface. No more position fixes from external references. The submarine was now completely dependent on her internal navigation systems and the skill of her crew. The 96-hour transit was a masterpiece of navigation under demanding conditions. Lieutenant Shepard Martin Jenks, the submarine's navigator, bore primary responsibility for guiding the vessel through waters where no charts existed and no landmarks were visible. He relied on the N6A-1 ship's inertial navigation system, a top-secret device installed just months earlier. This inertial navigation system used sensitive accelerometers and gyroscopes to track the submarine's position by measuring every acceleration and turn from a known starting point. It was naval adaptation of cruise missile guidance technology, and the first such system ever installed on a submarine. Jenks supplemented the inertial system with a Sperry Mark 19 gyro compass, dead reckoning calculations, and hourly cross-checks between all instruments. 4 quartermasters worked in continuous rotation, verifying calculations and watching for any sign of navigational drift. A single error could send the submarine into an underwater mountain or beneath ice too thick to escape. The margin for error was measured in feet, not miles. Above the submarine, the ice canopy presented an ever-changing obstacle course. Lion's upward-looking sonar painted a continuous picture of the frozen ceiling. The ice varied wildly in thickness. Some areas showed clear water or thin new ice just a few feet thick. Other sections revealed massive pressure ridges extending 40, 50, even 60 feet below the surface. The submarine threaded between these inverted mountains, sometimes with only a few feet of clearance overhead. The crew maintained their watch routines with methodical precision. Men not on duty tried to sleep, but rest came hard when everyone knew that a single miscalculation could end their lives. The cooks prepared regular meals. The engineering team monitored the reactor constantly, watching for any sign of trouble. Carbon dioxide levels were checked hourly. Oxygen generation continued without interruption. The submarine's systems performed flawlessly, a testament to the demanding standards that Admiral Rickover had imposed during construction. Anderson had prepared contingency plans for emergencies. If the reactor failed or the submarine suffered critical damage, the crew would attempt to locate a polynya, a patch of open water in the ice and surface. If no polynya could be found, the torpedoes could potentially blast a hole through thinner ice sections. It was a desperate option, unlikely to succeed, but it was all they had. In truth, if something went seriously wrong beneath the polar ice, the 116 men aboard Nautilus would probably die. There would be no rescue, no help would come. The submarine's presence was secret, its location unknown to anyone on the surface. Communications were impossible. No radio signals penetrate through the ice canopy. For 96 hours, Nautilus was completely cut off from the outside world. The men could only hope that their families and their navy would eventually learn what had happened to them, whether in triumph or tragedy. The crew settled into tense routine. Watches changed every 4 hours. The cooks prepared meals in the galley, serving familiar foods that provided a small comfort in alien surroundings. Men wrote letters that could not be sent, read books, played cards, and tried not to think about the millions of tons of ice pressing down above them. The hull creaked occasionally as external pressure changed with depth. Every unexpected sound drew nervous glances toward the overhead. On August 3, 1958, at 23:15 hours Eastern Daylight Time, Nautilus passed beneath the geographic North Pole. The fathometer recorded an ocean depth of 2,235 fathoms, which equals 13,410 feet. This was some 2,000 feet deeper than existing charts had predicted, proof of how little humanity knew about the Arctic basin. Above the submarine, solid ice made surfacing impossible. Nautilus simply passed through the pole at approximately 20 knots and continued south toward the Atlantic. Anderson's announcement over the intercom sparked celebrations throughout the ship. Some men marked the occasion by walking from bow to stern, ceremonially crossing from one side of the world to the other. Others requested permission to walk around the periscope housing, technically circumnavigating the globe by walking around the pole. Photographs were taken. Handshakes exchanged. The tension of the previous days released in a wave of jubilation and relief. But the mission was not yet complete. The submarine still had to navigate the remaining distance to open water, threading through ice formations that remained just as dangerous as those they had already passed. Anderson reminded his crew that celebrations could wait until they reached safety. The focus returned to the instruments and the ice. The submarine continued south, navigating between Greenland and Spitsbergen toward open water. On August 5, 1958, Nautilus surfaced northeast of Greenland in ice-free waters. The crew felt sunlight and fresh air for the first time in days. The radio operators faced a new challenge. Arctic atmospheric conditions created havoc with radio propagation, and the first attempts at communication failed. The ionosphere in polar regions behaves unpredictably, sometimes blocking signals entirely and sometimes bouncing them thousands of miles in unexpected directions. After numerous tries, they finally raised a Navy radio station at Pearl Harbor, the same station from which the mission had originated. The coded message was brief but historic. Nautilus 90 North. The transmission was in Morse code, addressed to Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Ali Albert Burke, who immediately relayed the news to President Eisenhower. The mission had succeeded. Nautilus proceeded to Reykjavik, Iceland, arriving on August 7th. A helicopter waited to airlift Commander Anderson directly to Washington for a meeting with the President. Lieutenant Commander Frank Adams, the executive officer, assumed temporary command of the submarine. On August 8, 1958, at 13:45 hours, President Eisenhower stood before reporters at the White House. The news he announced electrified the nation. The president revealed that Nautilus had accomplished what had been considered impossible. An American submarine had sailed beneath the North Pole, transiting from the Pacific to the Atlantic through a route that opened new possibilities for naval operations and scientific research. Eisenhower presented Anderson with the Legion of Merit and awarded Nautilus the first peacetime presidential unit citation in American history. Every man who had served aboard during the polar transit received recognition. The administration carefully crafted its messaging. Officials spoke of peaceful applications, scientific research, the possibility of future commercial shipping through Arctic waters, and the Atoms for Peace program that Eisenhower had championed. But the military implications were impossible to miss. American submarines could now transit between the Pacific and Atlantic fleets without using the Panama Canal, cutting thousands of miles from deployment routes. More importantly, American submarines could approach the Soviet Union from an entirely unexpected direction. The entire 3,000-mile northern coastline of Russia, previously considered invulnerable to naval attack, was suddenly exposed. A 1958 analysis in the United States Naval Institute proceedings spelled out the strategic implications with chilling precision. From the ice pack east of Spitsbergen, it measured approximately 400 miles to Murmansk, 880 miles to Archangel, 1,180 miles to Leningrad, and 1,420 miles to Moscow. A missile-launching submarine could reach and maintain position in the ice pack without its presence being known. It was virtually immune to detection. The Arctic Ocean had transformed from an impenetrable barrier into a strategic highway. The roof of the Soviet Union was no longer a defense, it was a vulnerability. The international reaction to the Nautilus announcement was immediate and dramatic. Allied nations celebrated the achievement as a triumph of Western technology. Newspapers around the world carried front-page stories about the polar transit. Scientists praised the expedition as opening new frontiers for oceanographic research. The peaceful rhetoric of scientific exploration provided diplomatic cover for what everyone understood was primarily a military demonstration. In Washington, the success provided exactly the morale boost that Eisenhower had sought. The humiliation of Sputnik began to fade as Americans celebrated their own technological triumph. Editorial writers proclaimed that America had proven its superiority in the technologies that truly mattered for national defense. The missile gap fears did not disappear entirely, but they were tempered by the knowledge that American ingenuity remained world-class. On August 27, 1958, Nautilus received a hero's welcome in New York City. A ticker-tape parade down Broadway drew crowds estimated at 250,000 people. Admiral Rickover, Commander Anderson, and the crew rode through canyons of cheering spectators while confetti rained from skyscraper windows. The crew lunched atop the Empire State Building, honored as American heroes. A special golden N clasp was authorized for every crew member's service ribbon, a permanent recognition of their achievement that they could wear for the rest of their naval careers. The Soviet reaction to the Nautilus achievement remains partially obscured by the secrecy that characterized the Cold War era. Despite extensive research through academic, naval, and historical archives, no directly documented verbatim public statements from Soviet admirals, specifically responding to the Nautilus polar transit in August 1958, have emerged in available English language records. This silence is itself historically significant. Soviet state media, including Pravda, Izvestia, and the TASS news agency, routinely suppressed or minimized Western technological achievements. Acknowledging American success would undermine the narrative of inevitable Soviet victory that the Communist Party promoted constantly. The Kremlin's public approach was almost certainly to ignore or downplay the voyage, rather than acknowledge American superiority in submarine technology. But the private Soviet response tells a very different story. Soviet naval leadership understood immediately what Nautilus had demonstrated. The Arctic was no longer a barrier protecting the Soviet homeland. American submarines could operate freely beneath the ice, undetected by any existing Soviet technology. They could approach Soviet territory from the north, launch missile attacks, and disappear without trace. The strategic implications were terrifying for Soviet military planners. This realization sent shockwaves through Soviet military planning. Admiral Sergei Georgievich Gorshkov, who had become Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy in January 1956, recognized that the Nautilus achievement demanded a fundamental reassessment of Soviet naval strategy. Everything the Soviet Navy had built for coastal defense was now potentially obsolete. Gorshkov was already transforming the Soviet Navy from a coastal defense force into an ocean-going fleet capable of challenging American power globally. The Nautilus transit accelerated this transformation dramatically. Resources were redirected from traditional surface combatants to submarines and missiles. The race to match American underwater capabilities became a matter of national survival. The Soviet nuclear submarine program had actually begun before Nautilus completed her construction. On September 9, 1952, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin signed a decree authorizing Object 627, the Soviet Union's first nuclear submarine project. The program was a direct response to intelligence about Nautilus being under construction in America. More than 135 Soviet organizations participated in the crash program. 20 design bureaus, 35 research institutes, and 80 factories contributed to the effort. The scale of resources committed demonstrated how seriously Soviet leadership viewed the nuclear submarine threat. The resulting submarine, designated K-3, was laid down on September 24, 1955. She was launched on August 9, 1957. On July 4, 1958, exactly 1 month before Nautilus crossed the pole, K-3 went underway on nuclear power for the first time. Admiral Gorshkov and Defense Minister Dmitry Fedorovich Ustinov personally attended the reactor startup trials. K-3 was a November-class attack submarine, the first nuclear-powered submarine built by the Soviet Union. She was larger than Nautilus, displacing over 4,000 tons, submerged, and capable of similar underwater speeds. But she had been rushed into service, and reliability problems plagued her early operations. The Soviets achieved their own polar submarine transit nearly 4 years after Nautilus. On July 17, 1962, at 0650 Moscow time, K-3 crossed beneath the geographic North Pole. The submarine was commanded by Captain Second-Rank Lev Mikhailovich Jiltsov, operating under the overall direction of Rear Admiral A1 Petlin. K-3 had departed her Arctic base at Zapadnaya Litsa on July 11th. During the voyage, the submarine surfaced to plant a Soviet flag on the ice, then continued toward the pole. K-3 spent 178 hours traveling 1,294 miles underwater. Unlike Nautilus, which could not surface at the pole due to solid ice coverage, K-3 managed to find polynyas, patches of open water, and surfaced at the pole 3 times. When K-3 returned to her home port, Soviet Premier Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev and Defense Minister Marshal Rodion Yakovlevich Malinovsky were waiting at the Murmansk base to greet the crew. The command staff received the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor the Soviet state could bestow. On October 9, 1962, K-3 was renamed Leninsky Komsomol, honoring the Young Communist League. Soviet analysts later assessed the achievement in frank strategic terms. Soviet submariners had confirmed that Arctic ice would not be an obstacle for nuclear missile submarines. A missile strike could be launched from beneath the polar ice, significantly increasing the missile's strike range and making detection virtually impossible. The Arctic had become a battleground. Both superpowers now possessed submarines capable of lurking beneath the ice, carrying nuclear missiles that could devastate enemy cities with virtually no warning. The Cold War had entered a new and more dangerous phase. USS Skate followed Nautilus to the pole just 8 days later, on August 11, 1958. However, Skate could not surface due to the heavy ice coverage at that time. She returned the following March, and on March 17, 1959, became the first submarine to surface at the geographic North Pole, breaking through the ice in conditions of extreme cold and maximum ice thickness. It was during this surfacing that Skate's crew scattered the ashes of Sir Hubert Wilkins, fulfilling his lifelong dream of reaching the pole. Nautilus continued her distinguished career for another 2 decades. In October 1962, she participated in the naval blockade during the Cuban Missile Crisis, helping enforce the quarantine that prevented Soviet ships from delivering additional offensive weapons to Cuba. Over her operational lifetime, she logged more than 500,000 nautical miles, equivalent to circling the Earth approximately 20 times. Admiral Rickover himself viewed the polar transit as vindication of everything he had fought for. The demanding engineer who had been repeatedly passed over for promotion, who had made enemies throughout the Navy bureaucracy, had been proven right. Nuclear propulsion had accomplished what no conventional technology could achieve. The submarine he had driven his teams to build, insisting on perfection at every step, had rewritten the rules of naval warfare. Rickover would continue to dominate the nuclear navy for decades, eventually serving longer than any other officer in American naval history. His demanding standards became legendary. Officers who served under his command remembered interviews where he deliberately humiliated candidates to test their composure. He insisted that every component of a nuclear submarine be built to the highest possible specifications. He personally approved every officer who would serve on nuclear-powered vessels. His methods were controversial, but his results were undeniable. The nuclear submarines he built operated safely for decades without a single reactor accident. The submarine was decommissioned on March 3, 1980, at Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California. On May 20, 1982, she was designated a National Historic Landmark, recognizing her unique place in American history. On April 11, 1986, Nautilus opened as a museum ship at the Submarine Force Library and Museum in Groton, Connecticut, returning to the shipyard where she had been built more than 3 decades earlier. Today, Nautilus receives approximately 250,000 visitors annually. In 2021, she underwent a $36 million preservation project to ensure that future generations can walk her decks and understand what her crew accomplished beneath the Arctic ice. The men who served aboard Nautilus during Operation Sunshine have largely passed into history themselves. Commander William Anderson was promoted to captain and later served as a United States Congressman from Tennessee. He died on February 25, 2007. Dr. Waldo Lyon continued his Arctic research for decades, becoming the world's leading authority on submarine operations beneath ice. Lieutenant Shepard Jenks, the navigator who guided Nautilus through uncharted waters using instruments that barely existed, rose to the rank of captain before his retirement. The legacy of their voyage extends far beyond the headlines of 1958. The polar transit proved that nuclear submarines could operate anywhere in the world's oceans, transforming naval strategy permanently. Today, nuclear ballistic missile submarines patrol beneath the Arctic ice as part of the nuclear deterrent forces of multiple nations, a direct continuation of the capabilities Nautilus first demonstrated. The voyage also revealed how rapidly the technological balance could shift during the Cold War. The Soviet Union, caught off guard by American capabilities they had not anticipated, was forced into a crash program that consumed enormous resources. The underwater arms race that followed produced ever more capable submarines on both sides, submarines that still form the backbone of nuclear deterrence today. What Soviet admirals truly said when they learned of the Nautilus achievement may never be fully known. The archives of that era remain partially classified in both nations, but their actions spoke louder than any words could. The frantic acceleration of Soviet submarine development, the redirection of naval priorities, the urgent effort to match American under-ice capabilities, all demonstrated that they understood precisely what had happened. An American submarine had sailed beneath the North Pole completely undetected. It had passed through waters that Soviet strategists considered secure. It had demonstrated that the Soviet homeland was vulnerable from a direction they had never seriously considered. And it had done all of this while the Soviet Navy remained completely unaware. The 96 hours that Nautilus spent beneath the ice changed the geometry of nuclear deterrence forever. Before August 3, 1958, the Arctic Ocean was a frozen barrier, an impenetrable shield protecting northern approaches. After that date, it became a highway, a patrol zone, a hiding place for submarines carrying weapons that could end civilization. Commander Anderson and his 116 men did not fire a shot. They did not engage an enemy. They simply sailed their submarine through waters that no one believed could be navigated. In doing so, they accomplished something that all the missiles and bombers and armies of the Cold War could not. They fundamentally changed how both superpowers understood their own vulnerability. Today, visitors to the Submarine Force Library and Museum in Groton, Connecticut, can walk through the compartments where the crew lived and worked during their historic voyage. They can see the navigation instruments that guided the submarine through uncharted waters. They can stand in the control room where Commander Anderson made decisions that would reshape military strategy for generations. The submarine herself sits quietly at her pier, her reactor long since removed, and her days of active service decades in the past. But the achievement she represents remains as significant as ever. During those 4 days beneath the ice, Nautilus proved that human ingenuity could overcome any barrier. She proved that nuclear technology, properly harnessed, could accomplish what had seemed beyond reach. She proved that in the struggle between superpowers, technological superiority could shift the balance more effectively than any weapon. The world's first nuclear submarine had demonstrated that the frozen roof of the Arctic was no longer a barrier. The oceans belonged to those with the technology to master them, and in the silent depths beneath the pole, a new dimension of warfare had opened that continues to shape international relations to this day. Nautilus 90 North, 3 words that changed the world.